Right. We're up to Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, the Mishnah, 10 lines from the top. Let's see, let's get this. It's still not on. Right, now it's on. It says the Mishnah, Choitchin Yabeles B'Mikdash. You're allowed to cut a wart in the base of Mikdash. Avalu b'Medina, but not the rest of Eretz Yisrael. Being b'keli, that's talk about when you cut it with your hand. But if you want to use a keli, like you want to use a knife, can also not allowed to cut. Says the Gemara. Now there's a problem of goizes with cutting a yabeles. The problem of goizes. Rabbi Stephen, like we mentioned before, Rabbi Lezer and Chachamim have a fundamental machlokus regarding machshirei mitzvah. This is actually information from the next Masechta, the Pesachim. The halacha is allowed to shech the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. The question is, preparations for the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, is that also permitted on Shabbos? Herkevoi, that means getting it, carrying it, or walking it, mechutz l'tchum, that means carrying it as it is of metaltal, of carrying the Rabim, but also mechutz l'tchum is walking out of the tchum. V'chatichas yapeltoi, ein doich, not doich Shabbos. The Mishnah gives 3 examples and not doich Shabbos. What are the 3 examples? Carrying it, walking from the outside of the tchum, and cutting off a wart. That's talking about cutting the wart of a Korban Pesach. Before we were talking about, by the way, cutting in the base of Mikdash a Korban Tomid. That's it. This is about Korban Pesach. So the Gemara says it's a steer. Now, why is it a steer? Because our Mishnah is a stam Mishnah, and the Mishnah says stam choitchin, you're allowed to. And the next Mishnah says, Mishnah Pesachim, ein doichin. A stam Mishnah says you're not allowed to. Now, one simple answer would be, what would the simple answer be? Yeah, because Rabbi Lezer himself says doichin. So it could be that our Mishnah is going to be Rabbi Lezer. One wants to say that the stam Mishnah is going to be Rabbi Lezer. Yeah. Rabbi Lezer, the Gemara gives first of all 2 answers. Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina. Chad Omar, and we'll have to get this very clear because we're going to tell this again and again and again. Our Mishnah seems to say that you're allowed to cut. The Mishnah in Pesachim says you're not allowed to cut. So we're going to have loads of answers to differentiate. Now, in fact, one answer, our Mishnah itself didn't give a blanket statement that you're allowed to, because the Mishnah said you're allowed to cut with your hand, but not with a keli. So it could be the Mishnah in Pesachim is talking about with a keli. Why do you need that Mishnah? What asks that? It's not always, more does repeat. Mishnah has to repeat themselves, but you're right. Why we need both. But again, one is simple answer is that our Mishnah starts off by saying that you're allowed to is talk about cutting with your hand. The Mishnah Pesach is not allowed to could be referring to a keli. Alternatively, there's a big difference between a wet diabeles, meaning a moist one, and a dry one. When a wart gets very dry, it crumbles off the skin. So it's not actually cutting, a scab. Yeah. So then it's not actually doing goises. I remember Falcon speaking that if you've got a very piece of dry skin, which is completely dry and it's no longer growing, there is no issa goises to take it off. But what's the problem of taking it off? Is that invariably when you take off a dry piece of skin, as you're pulling it off, you also pull off part of the moist skin which is underneath. But if you would only get the dry, there's no problem goises. Again, so the more now going to give 2 answers. Both which I talk about moist, which there should be also v'leikash can be ad kan mekeli. Our Mishnah says which is mutter. It's talking about a hand. There's talking about keli. One's Mishnah is talking about a moist one which is forbidden. The Yevesha is mutter. It says, if they say that you're allowed, that we're talking about once to yad, once to keli, why didn't he give the other answer? Why didn't he differentiate between lach and yevesha? If we're talking about a dry one, then the Mishnah, our Mishnah says which is mutter, it's about a dry one, and that's why it's mutter. Then the Mishnah wouldn't have finished off that you're not allowed to do it bekeli, because since it is dry, you're even allowed to cut off with a keli because it's not a problem. He asked you a question, Moshe, that if this Mishnah is telling us you're allowed to with your hand and not with a keli, and the Mishnah Pesachim is telling you you're not allowed because it's all about a keli, so the Mishnah Pesachim hasn't added anything at all. Masha'enkin, if you say like I'm saying that Madama says, that there's a lach and yovish, so then I would gain something. And there's a Mishnah talking about something which in this Mishnah never talked about.
Does the Mishnah make sense? If the mice is not also.
No, because he holds that if it's dry, even the keli would be also, because he holds, yes.
So they argue about that as well.
They argue about that as well. Very good.
Well,
Yes, they argue about that as well. According to the man, so our Mishnah talk about Yovish.
Right.
And after the Mishnah finishes off, Akedi is awesome. Now the other man says you can't say such a thing because if it's Yovish, what's wrong cutting it off with a knife? No, they don't. But this man says no. That since in the end of the day it looks like Goizes, so therefore even with a Akedi it is awesome. Oh, Bedoch. Hadik to the awesome. Why is the Mishnah repeated there? We want to mention the Machlikus of Lezer Rabbanon. Our Mishnah doesn't mention the Machlikus of Lezer Rabbanon. This Mishnah does. So therefore, you're right that the Mishnah Pesachim is not really adding anything new in the Tanakama, but it's adding something new in Shittas Rabbi Lezer. The other man Dama says, is that right? Missed out? No, that if we're talking about devices, that means if we're talking about cutting, that means we're not talking. That means we're not talking. Let's get it clear, right? Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, but more than that, is if that Mishnah was talking about, you're saying it's Lach and Yovish. Says the Gemara, I don't like the Sov Lach and Yovish. Why don't I like the Sov Lach and Yovish? Because if you say that the Mishnah in Pesach is talking about Lach, then it's a proper Issa D'Oraisa. It's proper Issa D'Oraisa, right? Because it's proper Goyis. I know, and the Mishnah says 3 examples. What are the 3 examples we allowed you? To carry it, to bring it out of the Tchum, and to cut off a wart. Now, if cutting off the wart is D'Oraisa, it would be logical the other 2 are D'Oraisas. They're not D'Oraisas. The other 2 are D'Rabbanons. Why the D'Rabbanons? Out of the Tchum is D'Rabbanon, and carrying, why is carrying a sheep D'Rabbanon? Because Chanu says that's what. So therefore, says the Gemara, it can't be talking about lacha over there. It can't be talking about a moist one. Because if you talk about a moist water, it would be D'Oraisa. And by D'Oraisa, that's not what the Mishnah is talking about, because the Mishnah is talking about D'Rabbanons. How do the Mishnah talk about D'Rabbanons? Because the first 2 are D'Rabbanons. D'Rabbanon, V'idach. Says, well, no. You're right, the Mishnah is about only D'Oraisas. How can the Mishnah talk about D'Oraisas? It's going B'shittas Rav Nosson that says that Chanu says Atzmo, and since the Chai carries himself, said not like Rav Nosson. So, not like Rav Nosson says Chanu says Atzmo, but rather that we don't say Chanu says Atzmo. If you remember, we had the Machlikus if Chanu says Atzmo or not. So if you're going to the Chai is not no says Atzmo, so carrying a sheep would be D'Oraisas. Have also b'chutz Tchum, ki Rabbi Akiva Doma Tchum in D'Oraisa. That means again, we had a steer between the Mishnah and our Mishnah and another Mishnah. We have 2 fundamental answers. One answer is that we're talking about over here by Yad, they were talking about Bekedi. The problem with that is that our Mishnah, what's that Mishnah adding? The answer is only adding Shittas Rabbi Lezer because our Mishnah already tells us Bekedi is no good. Or our Mishnah is talking about a dry one, that Mishnah is talking about a moist one. The reason our Mishnah doesn't like it is because by a dry one, even by a Bekedi would be mutter. Most of Abisov doesn't like either of these 2 answers. Rabbi Lezer in that Mishnah continues the argument. He said you're allowed to carry your sheep outside the Tchum on Shabbos. Why? Because it's just like Shchitas Pesach is Doicha Shabbos, also Machshire Pesach Doicha Shabbos. He says, I'll prove it to you. Which is a proper Issa D'Oraisa. Doicha Shabbos out to Shechted, Elu Shum Shmashvus and Doicha Shabbos. So you see that we're talking about what kind of Isum D'Rabbanon. So for that knocks away the answer that Mishnah is talking about a moist wart, because a moist wart would be an Issa D'Oraisa. Elamai would talk about a dry one. So you can't say that lacha and yerisha. And the Rishonim explained they didn't like the other answer that Yad Bekedi because he felt that at the end of the day, that's our Mishnah takes. What's the other Mishnah adding? What's the Mishnah adding? Elamai v'yesav hava hava yad v'shvus b'mikdash etiu shvus de mikdash b'medina lo etiu. Korban Pesach, who's the one that is, who's responsible for the Korban Pesach?
Another person.
The person himself. Our Mishnah is about Korban Tomit. Who's responsible for the Kohanim? Kohanim, we said, Zvizim. But every single person is not Zoitz. So therefore, you can't say that every person who goes, when he brings a Korban Pesach, what's the first thing he needs to do is check if it's got any warts, because water can't bring it. So if we allow him to cut it, he may come and do other Yisur D'Oraisa. So Vishlam, with the Kohanim, we allow the Beis Midrash. There's something which is important, meaning a Shvus which is important for Beis Midrash. But it's not done in the Beis Midrash. That's not permitted. Only a shvus which is done in the Beis Mikdash. Let's get a clear difference. Our Mishnah is b'mikdash. This is a shvus the mikdash of the mikdash, but it's not in the mikdash. It's outside the mikdash because everybody would check the Korban Pesach at home.
Outside by Kohen, it's not.
No, it has to. It has to be inside the
mikdash.
It's a Kohen in the Beis Mikdash. Will care. You need both. Yosa Abai become a Shemaitza. Abai said it over. Israel Safla Abai, or you could say for that scoop if you didn't say for on a doorstep. This guy will say for me or do you go to let's say you have to bring it up. But the Shvus the Mikdash b'Medinahu. It's a very interesting correlation, and that is that just like we want, the Gemara understands at this stage that just like in the Beis Hamikdash, we want to be matter things, we want to do avodah. Also, rolling your Sefer Torah back in is also very, very important. And yet, over here, it's done outside the Beis Hamikdash, every single person. So we're allowing you to do something outside the Beis Hamikdash because of the chashivus of it, even though you're not a kohen. Because I'm reading the Sefer Torah, sitting on my doorstep, I'm not a kohen, and yet I'm allowed to put it in. Why am I allowed to put it in? Answer is because since it's a choshva thing, we're allowed. Same thing about Korban Pesach. Okay, it's not in the Beis Hamikdash, but let me cut the water outside the Beis Hamikdash. Or not goes. The answer is the word maten isuri d'Rabbanan outside the Beis Hamikdash, even though I'm not a kohen, simply because it's an important thing. It says the Gemara, the same thing should be regarding the Korban Pesach. Are we not talking about a doorstep of a Karmelis, where the Maisa, it's a double D'Rabbanan, because one D'Rabbanan is that you're only standing on the Karmelis and it's rolling into a Shusarabim, which is only D'Rabbanan from a Shusarabim to a Karmelis. And second of all, you're holding on to one end of the Sefer Torah, so therefore it's not considered carrying anyway. And a double D'Rabbanan, we don't say Gzeil, and that's why we permit it, not because we're allowing you to be over Isuri D'Rabbanan because of the importance, like you thought, and therefore you ask the question, we should do the same thing like Korban Pesach, but only because it is a double D'Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, the Gemara carries on. Since you're holding it and it's only into a Karmelis, there's not even a D'Rabbanan. The halacha is you're not allowed to roast something for the first time on Shabbos because we're choishish that you'll come to stoke the coals. Yet the Korban Pesach, they allowed it. Everybody, if for example Pesach will like this, Pesach the Shabbos, in Mitzvah Mashiach will come. And then we'll shech the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. Why? Because we've got no choice, because it's a Korban Pesach on Shabbos. But roasting it, we won't be able to. And we'll have a mad, hectic time, because we'll have to roast the Korban Pesach, Motzei Shabbos, and bake the matzahs, because that's what the Rambam says you should do, and have a seder, and finish it all by Chatzos. And the Gemara says, it's possible, how can you? You're not allowed to roast the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. It's outside the Beis Hamikdash, because at the end of the day, who roasts it? Everybody outside. But it goes, so Abaya gave up, and he didn't know what to say. This is what Safa said to me, that I don't like this answer because we allow you to roast the Korban Pesach. There's a difference, because even though cutting the water of the Korban Pesach is done at home, and that you can't rely, we don't allow you. But over here, the roasting was done by the people who were responsible for it. And they're called Bnei Chabur. The one Pesachim says that just like Kanim Zvizim, the Bnei Chabur also Zvizim Hein. Now, by Kanim Zvizim Hein, we know Bnei Chabur Zvizim Hein, we know. Let's go from, our Mishnah says you're allowed to cut a water. The Mishnah in Pesachim says you're not allowed to. We have so far three fundamental answers. One is our Mishnah is talking about doing it in the hand. The Mishnah there is talking about doing it to the keli. The problem with that is because our Mishnah tells us what's the advantage of that. That's the main problem. One answer is our Mishnah is talking about a dry one. The main problem if it's a dry one is that why the keli is it's also if it's dry, it should be mitzvah the keli. And the third answer we've given is that our Mishnah is talking about Korban Pesach at home. There it's talking about, our Mishnah is talking about Korban Tomid, which is in the Beis Hamikdash, and that Mishnah is talking about Korban Pesach at home, and we don't allow you to do it at home. The main problem with that is we see that they did allow certain things for the Korban Pesach, for example, the roasting, etc. He gives another answer. It's Rabbi Lezer, our Mishnah is Rabbi Lezer, which is a fourth answer. And in fact, it's a very simple answer, which you could have said at the beginning. Because the Mishnah there doesn't say that it is forbidden. Our Mishnah says permitted. That Mishnah says it's forbidden. Rabbi Lezer says it's mutter. So our Mishnah which says it's mutter is Rabbi Lezer. Now, what's the problem saying it's Rabbi Lezer? A very big problem. Because our Mishnah says you're not allowed to do it with a keli. Now, Rabbi Lezer said, we said yesterday, he's allowed to do anything for a mitzvah. You're even allowed to cut the wood to make yourself a metal knife in order to make a bismillah. So why can't you cut the Korban Pesach's wood or the Korban Tomid's wood with a knife? It says more that you try and avoid being Mechal Shabbos as much as possible. That means if you need to Mechal Shabbos, you're allowed to Mechal Shabbos for everything you need in order to prepare for the mitzvah. But as much as possible, we try and do a shinui. So therefore, similarly now, the Mishnah says that as much as possible you do a shinui. So therefore, you're allowed to cut the water with a knife. Why is Mishnah saying not allowed to cut it with a knife? Because you can do it with a hand. So we'll ask you to cut it with a knife. Now, where do we see this concept that Rabbi Lezer holds that if you can avoid it, you must avoid it. Till now, I've always been learning that Blazer says, the Tanya. A Kohen that has a wart on his hand. Even not on his hand, the Kohen is not supposed to do the avoid if it's got a wart because it's considered like a mum over. So his friend bites it off. Let's say a person needs to do a tefillah mitzvah on Shabbos, right? And he forgets to cut his nails, and nice could be a chatzitza. So you have to get a goat to bite off your nails on Shabbos. All those who hold that goat can cut your nails. But we'll talk about it. It does. Yeah. I think it's a place where you can tell a goat. Okay. The Kohen shows the Yaveles chaver chutchele b'shinov and mikeli loy. You have to with his teeth and not with a keli. Chaver and iloy. But his friend does it, not himself. Now, there's two chidushim in this brisa. What's the two brisa says? One is that the way that he's cut off the waters with his teeth, and one is you don't do it yourself, your friend do it. Now we had it in Shabbos, unfortunately, even I took me time to remember it. Is like this: a fundamental shaila regarding cutting your nails. Shittas Chachamim is that biting your nails is not awesome in that term. Why is biting nails not awesome in that term? Because it's not a normal way of cutting your nails. Shittas Rabbi Les is it is awesome in that term. Why? Because a person could do a very fine job biting his nails. Now, this brisa is going like a bono or going like a bless. If it's going like a bono, then what in the world is the difference between me biting my nails or a friend biting my nails? In the end of the day, the chachamim hold that's all do a bono. So Elamai must begin with Shittas Rabbi Lezer that says what? That yourself biting your nails, you can do a fine job. Your friend biting your nails can't do a fine job, and therefore you have to get your friend to do it. Now, Rabbi Lezer, who's this Rabbi Lezer? It's the same Rabbi Lezer that says Shiur mitzvah. So you see that it permits you only b'derech shinui. Again, you've got a kohen, you want to do the avodah. And what's the brisa say? Get your friend to bite it. Again, who is it? It can't be Shittas Chachamim, because if it would be the Chachamim, they would say bite your own nails. Why? Bite your own wart. Because they hold that biting is only Drabonon, because it's not Keli. It must be Shittas Rabbi Lezer that holds that when you bite it yourself, you could do a fine job. So therefore, you have to get your friend to do it. But if it's Rabbi Lezer, why do you have to do it b'shinui? Do it a normal way. So it says Rabbi Lezer holds that you have to try your best to do it b'shinui. There, Rava proves this point, and in fact, Rava is going to stick to his guns, and he was going to try again and again to disprove him, and he was not going to. So this is the fourth answer. The question was Mishnah to Mishnah Pesachim, 4 answers. The fourth answer is Rava, the Mishnah is Shittas Rabbi Lezer, it is mutter. But as much as possible, you have to do a shinui. And now Rava is going to prove it, and then Rava is going to try and question again and again, and maybe the brisa means something else. So what's the brisa say? Since the Chachamim hold that whenever you bite something from yourself, it's only to Rabbanon, because it's not a normal way to do it. So what difference does it make? Let me bite it off myself. If you bite it yourself, it's awesome in natur. If your friend bites it, we actually had it in Shabbos. If your friend bites your nails, it's to Rabbanon. If you according to Rabbi Lezer, but if you bite your own nails, according to Rabbi Lezer, it's to Raisa. So Rabbi Lezer holds it's better somebody else should do it. Says really this price is Shittas Chachamim. We also be crazy. If you could bite it like it says on your stomach and you can reach over, okay. It's on your back, about Yotov on your elbow. You can't get to the back of your elbows. It's physically technical thing. So just took it with your hand. Why do you have to bite it off? Just take it off with your hand, peel it off. It must be that the whole machlokes is by a hand. By keli is also, and therefore the Bais is saying that you can't do it with your hand. It means to talk about bigger chiddush. Talk about do it with a hand. So according to Rab Lezer as well. Why should you get your friend do it with your hand? That means why with Rab Lezer, who says even if you say okay, Shittas Rab Lezer, do it with your hand, which is much easier than asking your friend to do it. Says Mahaimai. Let me like this. If we're going with Shittas Chachamim, that they say that the whole het of this price, again, we talk about Kohen's got a wart. Says the price, what should you do? Your friend should bite it off. We have two different markets to understand it. Either Shittas Chachamim or Shittas Rabbi Lezer. If it's Shittas Chachamim, that when you do it b'shinui, then you can do it with yourself. That's considered a shinui. Why in the world involve your friend? Just do it yourself and peel it off with your hand, bite it off with your thing, whatever it is. And the Rashi explains very long like this. According to Rabbi Lezer, he holds you're allowed to do anything because of Machshir mitzvah. But there's a mitzvah, as much as possible, avoid bringing over a Seder Raisa. Now, if you do it yourself, you could end up doing a deraisa. How could you end up doing a deraisa? Because you could end up doing it yourself with a keli or in a normal way, and you'd be able to deraisa. So therefore, that's why we insist that your friend should do it, because there's no way that your friend would be able to deraisa. Ma'ashekin, according to the Chachamim, that either way you're not going to be able to deraisa, so it makes no difference whatsoever. It must be shittas ableza. It's according to the Chachamim that once you do it with your hand or with your mouth, it's always derabanan. So therefore, the mission should the bison need to come on to somebody else. Just do it yourself. Must be ableza that holds that there's a difference between yourself.
That's a good answer.
So that's a good answer. So therefore, that answer stands at ableza. And if we see that ableza agrees that even if you're allowed to mechal Shabbos as much as you want, only still try to avoid it. And our Mishnah is shittas ableza. This is a typical dilshu kind of question. Our Mishnah says that you're allowed to cut a wood. The Mishnah Pesach says you're not allowed to. What are the four answers? Bonon.
And the wait.
There's a big dosh outside this big dosh. Should we do a little bit, or you feel we should stop? Or should you okay for you can need to
How much more time?
a few more days. I don't.
No.
Okay, we can. We'll stop. Okay, we'll stop. Right, we'll stop. Right, no, we'll stop. No, it won't be. Actually, it's not such hard to come on. Right, the Mishnah thing. Okay.